Well, Bob, good to have you with us today. If you don't know Bob, he's the lead pastor of Calvary Fellowship in Miami, Florida. Is it warm in Miami today?
Oh, it's hotter than you can imagine.
Well, I'm supposed to be living in hot Atlanta, but it hasn't been hot at all here this summer, so I guess that's a good thing for you.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to being in Atlanta in October, but we kind of have three seasons in Miami, which is hot, hotter, and then surface of the sun, which is kind of where we are now. Still, it's just boiling hot.
Yeah. Well, Bob, I want to begin by just allowing you to share a little bit about your journey in ministry and Calvary Fellowship. The church began with 7 people, but you're in a completely different place now. So could you share a little bit about that story?
Sure. Yeah, we did not have the typical, kind of what's become the norm now, which is the church launch. That terminology didn't even exist in 2000, or at least it wasn't in print when we started in 2000. So we started this guy. We wanted to start a church in this area in Miami, kind of the northwest corner of Miami-Dade County. And so there was a guy that I had met that wanted to open up his home, and I said, all right, so let's start. We'll just have this Bible study in your house. And it was my wife and I and 5 other people. And 2 of the people flaked out after the first week. So we were kind of building this thing in the wrong direction after the first week because there was only 5 of us the second week. And then, kind of the word got out and people started attending and whatnot. And we did that for a couple of months. And then we rented a hotel down the street. And we had probably about, I think the first Sunday, there's probably about 100 people there, most of whom were well-wishers. I used to run a college before coming and starting, so it was a lot of my students that were there. And so, but then, that kind of shakes out after the first couple of weeks, and then you kind of got a group of 30 or 40 people, and that's really what we ended up building from. And, fast forward now, almost 13 years later, and it's an amazing thing. As we were talking just before, we just bought our first piece of property that we're building on, and we're seeing lots and lots of people come to know Jesus every week, and that's been one of the things that when we came to Miami, I know every city, every guy has their stat, about their city or whatever, but Miami really is a very unchurched area, and we wanted to reach people, and one of the things that brought about the pull book was. We went through a season of the first 18 months of our church where we did not reach one person who didn't know Jesus. We had, Christians were coming and all that, and we were happy that they were there. Hey, we're happy that you're on the journey with us, but we were missing really the goal, which is we wanted to see people who were lost be found. And after that first 18 months, it really challenged me to reevaluate some of the things that we were doing, which really led into a lot of the strategies that we talk about in Pull, and really, I wouldn't say just focusing on unchurched people, because I think sometimes I can give the wrong connotation that it's like, you kind of like pastors get upset if a person who's already a Christian shows up, and but I think that we certainly became Great Commission focused, that we wanted to reach people and disciple them. And see them grow, from infancy all the way to maturity. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah. So you mentioned your new book, which will be out in a few weeks. It's called Pull, Becoming a Magnetic Church. Is that right? A church that's magnetic?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So help us then understand, as you've alluded to your story, you kind of went through a shift. But in that process, you've created a healthy culture of evangelism. And give us a picture of what that looks like in the context of a church.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that we talk about all the time, I mean, really, for me, the bottom line is the culture that you create. Because you can do all the direct mail in the world, you can have the coolest Facebook ads, you can have the best keywords on Google, but if people come into a church environment where non-Christians or new Christians are not welcome, like the culture is just repulsed by that, people aren't going to stay. Because you and I have walked into environments, maybe you, Tony, everybody likes you, but I've walked into environments where I haven't felt welcome, and you're just not really excited about going back, right? And so that's really the big thing for us is the culture itself because I think everything is won and lost there. And in particular, and I know it sounds kind of funny, but I really think the most important group to win over are your volunteers and your servants, because if your staff most of the time, at least in I work with tons of churches and my coaching networks and all that, but pastors, senior leaders usually get it that, hey, we want to reach people, we want to see people that are lost found, but it's kind of going from that top layer, if you will, kind of down a level. How does that communicate to the people that are serving, that are manning the doors, that are helping people park, that are checking in kids and all of that? If they haven't bought into that vision, because the leaders become the culture makers of the church.
So tell me, though I'm sure all of the elements of what a church does with the experiences and next steps and the groups and connecting and serving and so on, all of that plays into creating that culture that you're talking about and pull. But talk specifically to the teaching pastors, because it would seem of all of those areas that churches could address related to evangelism, really the easiest place to start is probably with the teaching that happens, because only one person's really involved in that. So
that's absolutely right.
So help pastors understand how maybe they can shift their approach to how they teach.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think that's some of the misconception about evangelistic preaching is, number one, that it's just about drawing the net at the end, which that's part of it, but it's not all of it. Really, evangelistic preaching is just being understandable. And so I use theological terms all the time, but I just have to take the time to define them every time I use them. And listen, as a guy who's a teacher and taught at a college, besides running one before starting a church, there's a shorthand that those of us who are really familiar with the Bible can speak in, and we have to really fight against that, our own tendency to do that, because we've got to slow down. And sometimes it's so simple, like, we can just say, well, it's kind of like the story of Jonah, and we kind of do this. Well, you know what? They don't know Jonah. Unless Jonah's their neighbor, they don't know who he is. And even some of the more familiar stories, and I'll tell you just kind of a silly thing, but it really hammered this home for me early on. I'm kind of a through the Bible expositional type of teacher, but I was teaching the book of Daniel. This is probably about 7 years ago, and I was teaching Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and I ended up taking the story and I cut it in half. So I get to the point where Nebuchadnezzar says, if you don't bow down to my image, I'm going to throw you into the fiery furnace, and who is the God who will deliver you from my hand? And I stopped it there, and then I was going to talk about, the deliverance the next week of all that God did in the fire, who's that fourth man, all that stuff. So I end the service, and not just one, but more than one person comes up to me and says, hey, Pastor Bob, so what happens at the end? And I'm thinking, man, isn't that like one of the more basic stories of the Bible? And yet when you are reaching and when you've got unchurched people in the crowd, you've just got to slow down enough to really communicate the basics. And sometimes it's like I said, it's like, man, I wish I could do more, but we've got to slow down and really define the terms. And I think, and not to really belabor the point, but I think sometimes we can say, well, we just got to kind of water it down. I think just the opposite. I think that, sometimes we think unchurched people, all they watch is E! And Entertainment Tonight. Lots of people are watching History Channel. Lots of people are watching shows on A&E that aren't like the reality stuff. There's lots of smart, unchurched people, and we're in an area where people are, pretty educated. And so, you don't have to dumb it down. You've just got to inform. And so that's one of the things that we've found is really just from the time of preparation, are you thinking about the person? Are you communicating this to from the perspective of the person that doesn't know anything about the Bible?
I actually appreciate your story, Bob, because people were asking the question, what happens in the end? And I wonder if that's what we want people to get to. We want people to get to that place in our teaching, rather than wrapping up all the teaching in a tidy package at the end of every message. I sometimes wonder if we don't want people to be asking questions so that they hopefully will begin pursuing the answers themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, you're absolutely right.
So let me ask you this question to wrap up. You've probably experienced this through your coaching and as you've connected with other churches. The churches find themselves stuck when it comes to impacting people outside the church and outside the faith. And what are a couple of key barriers that churches need to overcome if they want to begin to have impact in this area?
Yeah, I think one of them is really simple, but it's really having a passion to reach lost people. And most of the time, I'll tell you what, I have not met a pastor for the most part. I mean, there are some, but by and large, pastors want to reach people. Pastors go into ministry because they want to make a difference. They give their whole lives to starting churches or leading churches. But I think the real challenge is educating. Well, if I can step it back a little bit, most of the time, one of the things that I talk about in the beginning of Pull, in the introduction, I talk about Santa Claus, silver bullets, and other myths that we think that there's just like, I'm just going to implement this one thing and that's what's going to change the game. And it's not that. It's really several moving parts that change the game and change the culture. And one of the reasons why churches get stuck, just like anything else, is that we're answering questions and nobody's asking. We are not really communicating in a language that people understand. And I'll give you an example. We don't get much direct mail at our house. Most of the direct mail we get is from our church, but every once in a while I'll get something from another church. And I got it was a flyer. Someone was out there kind of handing out flyers. And it was this whole thing. I mean, front and back, it was messy, but it was this black and white photocopy, and it was all about, is this, are you looking for a church that talks about being washed in the blood? Are you looking for a church that talks about how to really be sanctified in the Holy Ghost? And, it kind of went on like that. Now, once again, these are all wonderful things. Everybody wants sanctification is change, being more like God. Being justified. Yeah, everybody wants to be justified, made right with God. The problem is people don't understand the terms. And what happens is that now this church does this. And my guess is, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it didn't have very much fruit and say, well, see, that just doesn't work. And that's why we're stuck. Well, it's once again, and it's bad copy because you're just not really speaking to the person who is going to be reading it. These are all wonderful concepts and things that we should be teaching, but we've got to communicate in a way that kind of whets the appetite and tells people, hey, can I just communicate in a way to where you are right now? But a lot of times, so that's maybe one thing. What I see happen with most churches is there really isn't a lot of emphasis on outreach, just in general, and that's one of the things that gets churches stuck. And I'll have pastors that'll call me or whatever, and they'll say, well, Bob, the grand majority, 90% of the people who come to our church come because a friend invited them. And I'll say, of course that's true if that's all that you're doing. So, but now once again, in a culture where you're doing a lot of different things, 60 to 65% of people who come are still going to come because friends invite them. But you're still, churches are leaving that 35% on the table of people that they could have reached and haven't. And so, we talk about this. We call it I call it the three spheres of outreach, where there's the internal, these are people that are in your church already. There's the peripheral. These are the people that have some connection to someone in your church. And then there's the external. That is the people in your community who have no connection to your church whatsoever. And one of the reasons that churches get stuck is because they don't have a strategy for reaching each of these three groups. So if all we're doing is personal invitation, well, how are you reaching the person who has no connection to anyone in your church whatsoever? And the younger your church is and the smaller your church is, the more likely that's going to be the dominant group in your community.
That's good stuff. All right, so Bob's book is called Pull. Making Your Church Magnetic. It'll be out in September. Other than getting that book, Bob, how else can people follow your journey, follow some of what you're sharing?
Yeah, well, they can follow my blog at bobfranquiz.net. They can follow me on Twitter, which is at bobfranquiz. Facebook, that's all there too. Or they can go to churchninja.com, which has all of our coaching and resources and all that good stuff.
Very good. All right, Bob, thanks again for joining us today.
You bet. Thanks so much, Tony.